I didn't realize how much space I was wasting in my garden, not because anything looked empty. Every bed was planted, every row had something growing, but a lot of that space wasn't really being used. It was just waiting, waiting for plants to grow in, waiting for harvests that were still weeks away. The first time this really clicked was with my tomatoes. I planted carrots in between them, not after the tomatoes were done, not in a separate garden bed, but right in between the tomato plants themselves. Normally, that space sits empty for weeks. Tomatoes don't go into my garden until mid to late May. Even then, they're small and they don't need much room yet. But carrots go into my garden much earlier, around mid-April. So instead of just leaving that soil bare, I planted 3 carrots in a row between where I planned to plant each tomato. At first, it felt a little wrong, like I was going to be crowding things, like I was just asking for trouble. But the timing worked out perfectly. The carrots grew throughout the spring and early summer while the tomatoes were still establishing. They didn't seem to compete or slow each other down. By late July, the carrots were ready to be harvested out before the tomatoes even started producing in August. By the time the tomatoes needed that space, the carrots were already gone. That same space gave me 2 harvests, and that's when I realized I wasn't running out of space in my garden. I was leaving it underused without meaning to. That realization changed how I thought about the whole garden. I had been seeing each of my spaces as fixed, locked in for one crop each season. But suddenly, the garden felt so much more flexible, like a living puzzle that I got to rearrange. This tomato bed is where this way of thinking started to carry into next season. Once I saw how well the carrots fit into that early window, I started watching that space later in the season and started thinking, what happens next? I single stemmed my tomatoes up a trellis, and I removed the lower leaves to improve airflow and reduce disease. By late summer, that leaves the bottom part of the trellis fairly open. This season, I want to try planting snap peas in front of the tomatoes. The timing just feels right. By the time the peas really start growing, the tomatoes will be nice and tall and focused on fruit production. The peas would stay low and use that bottom part of the trellis that's open, and hopefully I would get a nice crop of peas before a hard frost. I don't know yet if it'll work perfectly, but that's part of the point. It's just another example of how I'm starting to see each bed not as one decision, but as a lot of small little decisions that have overlapping opportunity. Even if the peas only produce a modest harvest, they're using up a space that otherwise would be bare, and to me, that's a worthwhile experiment. But not all interplanting came from careful planning this year. Some of it came from things not working out the way I expected them to. One of the clearest examples of this is my onion bed. I started losing onions to pests partway through the season, and all of a sudden I had big holes where I expected there to be a crop. In the past, I probably would have just accepted the losses and moved on, but this year I didn't want to leave any bare soil if I didn't need to. I needed something that wouldn't compete with the onions that were already there, that wouldn't take up a lot of space, and something that I could start from seed because I didn't have any other starts available. So I decided to plant beets, and beets were the perfect choice. They didn't take up very much space, and they filled in the space without disturbing the remaining onions. And they did so much better than I had expected. I ended up with beautiful, full-size beets that help offset some of the onion losses. That bed still produced value, even though it didn't go the way I expected, and that was an important shift for me. Instead of seeing pest damage as the end of the story, I was able to adapt and still get useful produce out of that space. Another interplanting choice that worked surprisingly well was green onions around my squash. The green onions went in early spring before the squash was even up and germinated, and they were ready to be harvested by the time the squash had grown and needed the room. I can't prove this definitely, but I think the smell of the green onions helped deter pests. I've had issues with some cucumber beetle on my squash plants in the past, and where I had planted green onions around the squash, I didn't seem to have that issue this year. Even if pest protection was only partly there, the onions themselves were an extra harvest that didn't take anything away from the squash. Next year, I want to experiment with this idea some more, using strong smelling herbs like oregano and basil. But interplanting was only half the shift. The other shift came from how I thought about time. For years, I treated each bed like it had one job for the whole season. Once it was planted out, it was spoken for, even if something finished up early. This year, I started asking the question, what happens next? And that changed everything. Broccoli is one of the clearest examples of this. I plant broccoli before my last frost, usually in late April, as long as the nighttime temperatures remained above 7 degrees Celsius. It grows beautifully in the cool weather of spring, but by the time the summer heat settles in, it's done. Normally, broccoli's out of my garden by the first week of July. This year, I leaned into the fact that I have a pretty decent growing window after the broccoli is harvested out. I have about 106 days between July and October that are frost-free. That's enough time for another crop if I choose carefully. So after the broccoli came out, I planted some heat-loving crops. I picked quick maturing varieties of peppers and winter squash. The July heat that would have ruined the broccoli helped these plants get established even faster. That bed didn't sit empty, the soil stayed active, and I got two completely different harvests from the same bed. One thing I'm going to be doing differently next year, however, is adding more nutrition between the crops. Broccoli is a heavy feeder, and I know the second planting of peppers and squash would have done much better if they had better nutrition. Still, this was one of the most effective uses of space in my garden. Potatoes gave me another opportunity to practice this way of thinking. Instead of letting the bed sit empty after I harvested the potatoes out in August, I planted turnips. They germinated quickly, they grew very fast, and they didn't seem to mind as the day got shorter heading into fall. This ended up being one of my favorite succession plantings of the year. In my experience, turnips do better with fall planting than carrots do. They are quicker to germinate and grow, and they are more resilient to the cooler temperatures heading into fall. Potato bed gave me two different harvests in one season. One was long and slow, and the other was quick and efficient. Interplanting allowed me to use space more thoughtfully. Succession planting allowed me to use time more intentionally, and together they changed how I moved throughout the season. Looking back, the biggest change wasn't the extra harvest. It was realizing that I didn't need more land, more beds, or more ambition to feed my family better. I just needed to pay more attention to what was already there, the space that was being left empty, and the time I wasn't using efficiently. If you have a favorite interplanting or succession planting combination, I would love to hear about it. In the next video, I will be sharing some garden assumptions I made in 2025 that cost me harvest and what I'm going to do to change them in 2026.